Hi, Chris.
Hey Bob,
How you doing?
I'm good.
Good. You're in Hong Kong.
I'm in Hong Kong. I'm normally in Beijing, but Hong Kong is where things are happening right now.
Okay. And let me introduce us in the event that there's anyone who doesn't instantly recognize you, which is hard to imagine. But you're Chris Beam, staff writer for the New Republic now. You used to be at Slate, which is where I think I first met you.
Indeed.
And you're covering one of the wilder stories in the world right now in Hong Kong. So, uh, catch us up on the story. There was going to be this meeting on Friday between
Right.
Hong Kong officials and the pro democracy protesters, and then the officials called the meetings off. Why don't you tell us why, and then kind of take it from there?
Yeah. So this latest development was a few days in coming. The protest leaders and the government leaders had finally agreed to sit down and hash out some sort of compromise, or at least talk over this issue of electoral reform.
Mm-hmm.
They set a date for Friday afternoon, um, and then on Thursday evening, a bunch of the protest leaders, some of them were student leaders, some of them were the pan-Democrat politicians. They got together and held a press conference where they said that they were going to step up their civil disobedience acts. So they were basically doubling down on blocking the streets, disrupting the functioning of the city, and the Democratic politicians now said they were going to take civil disobedience to the legislative council. So they were going to start filibustering. They were going to block funding for non-emergency public works. Basically, just use their powers to continue the civil disobedience. And right after they held this press conference, Carrie Lam, who was the chief secretary who was going to be part doing these talks on Friday, held her own press conference saying it's off.
Mm-hmm.
We don't. They said there was a lack of trust between the protest leaders and the government leaders. So basically, my read is that the protest leaders overplayed their hand,
Mm-hmm.
and they made it seem like no matter what happened with the talks, they were going to continue this civil disobedience.
Well, presumably their idea was they wanted to have leverage during the talks, maybe, and so they wanted to keep the pressure on.
Yeah,
The Hong Kong officials' idea was that agreeing to have the talks was going to deflate the crisis, and
yeah, exactly. I think the protest leaders wanted to signal to the government leaders and to their own followers, the protesters,
this, you
that
know,
they were serious, they meant
right,
business.
right.
But I mean, the fact is, I think the government was just looking for an excuse to cancel these talks anyway, because there's not actually any middle ground here. The protesters are asking for universal suffrage,
Mm-hmm.
one person, one vote, and you can't really go halfway on that.
Right.
I think that whatever compromise there is going to be is not going to be satisfying to the
Although, is the
protesters.
issue one person, one vote per se, or more the question of how the candidates will be selected? Right. I mean,
Yeah,
there's this process by which they select the candidates for chief executive of Hong Kong, and it's one of these complicated things where there's a committee that's selected in this way and blah blah blah. But what it winds up being is that Beijing controls who gets to run for chief executive of Hong Kong. Right. That's the
right.
story. The menu of options is greatly constrained, and my impression was that that's the main thing that the pro democracy people want change. Right? They want to be able to, in principle, vote. They want anyone to be able to run for chief executive in principle, right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the way the Beijing government is presenting this is under the British, you could never vote. For the last since 1997, since the handover to the mainland, you could never vote. But now in 2017, we are giving you universal suffrage,
Mm-hmm.
so everyone can vote. This is a step in the right direction towards democracy. But any candidates that are nominated by giant nominating committee of 1,200 people have to be approved by the Beijing government.
Right.
And so the Beijing is selling this as a step in the right direction, but protesters are saying, no, that's not real democracy. It's fake democracy. We want to have a vote that's unmediated by Beijing.
And you're saying just no way Beijing ever permits that, in your view?
No, because it all comes down to different interpretations of the deal that the British made with China back in 1984. They agreed that there would be a transition to an election where people would be able to vote for their leaders, but there was no they didn't specify how that would happen. They didn't specify what kind of say Beijing would or would not have. And then the British left. So there's now you have people like Chris Patton, Nick Clegg coming out and saying that China's not upholding its part of the deal. But Britain has no leverage now.
Well, I mean, in a way, they never did, right? Because they had just kind of leased Hong Kong, right? I mean, all along, the deal had been you have to give up Hong Kong in whatever year that was back then, right? I mean, basically, a lease expired, right? Isn't it?
Yeah, and so one question that's been in my mind this whole time is why isn't Britain getting more flack for this? Because why did they not go and implement democracy before leaving in 1997? And why did they expect the world's largest authoritarian government to implement that for them?
Yeah, kind of a strange country to outsource the job to.
Right, exactly.
You're not going to do it yourself, yeah.
No, but it turns out that Britain was trying to do this. There's these historical documents have come to light where as far back as the 1950s, British consuls, diplomats were trying to nudge Hong Kong in the direction of autonomy, but the Chinese said absolutely not. If you do that, then that's maybe not a declaration of war, but a hostile act. And so then come the 1980s, 1990s, Britain did try and hasten some sort of democratic reforms, but it wasn't nearly enough. And so but any attempts that they made to do that were resisted by the Chinese side, because China knew that once the handover happened, they wanted to have their own. They wanted to be part of China. They didn't want it to be autonomous. And so that's how we had this, one country, two systems deal, which is as ambiguous and sort of unproductive. It was seen as a brilliant diplomatic compromise, but there are so many questions left unanswered that are continuing to play out now.
And was the idea all along that it would eventually move toward one country, one system? I mean, that's what I had heard, is that that's the plan. And I don't know whether that was a plan all along, but it's like 20 years from now or something like that, there's this end point where this kind of convergence of the systems is supposed to have taken place. And, and the people have different ideas about whether the convergence should be more or less democratic.
Yeah, I mean, what's so crazy about it is that this deal between the British and China that Hong Kong would maintain its own system for 50 years after 1997, and then after those 50 years, Hong Kong would be reintegrated into China. The fact that the British thought this was a good idea shows their complete misconception of what was going to happen to China over those 50 years. They thought that China would liberalize, that its economic growth would fuel some sort of democratic transition, so that 50 years later, Hong Kong integrating into China wouldn't be so bad. They thought the mainland would evolve to look more like Hong Kong rather than the mainland, of course, having economic growth, but continuing this political autocracy where they kept meddling with, where they limited the ability of Hong Kong to transition to its own autonomous system.
Well, China is in some ways more open than it was in the Cold War. I mean, in terms of information getting in and out, and probably even the way Chinese citizens do mobilize to air grievances in various ways and so on. But structurally, it just hasn't changed. It's just a one-party system, and it's not in any sense a democracy. And
I think that openness is in many ways an illusion. Because
I think when people say that, I generally hear that from people your age, and I say, you don't know what it was like. I mean, no one had any idea in like the 1970s what was going on in China, and no one in China had any idea what was going on outside of China, and that's really not an exaggeration. I don't think not much of one. And
no, you're right.
It was a curtain, and so it's not like that, is what I mean. And
right, that's true.
Chinese citizens they have there's a lot of civil unrest in China, as I'm sure you know, right? I mean, they like mobile, and the government does respond to some of these grievances, right? It's just that they're not expressed at the ballot box.
Yeah, I mean, you could argue that the Chinese government allowing local protests against, say, factories that are polluting rivers, or
right, exactly.
Violence against citizens. Those sort of local protests, the government is quite responsive to, but they do their best to keep it localized and to prevent information from getting out across the country. And sure, Chinese kids can watch American TV shows now. They can watch House of Cards. There's more awareness of the outside world, but that has not translated into more political participation. The Chinese civil society is still totally stunted.
Yeah.
So I think you have this gesture towards opening up, but if you still can't find basic information about vast periods of Chinese history on the internet there.
Right.
And so I when I say it's an illusion, I don't mean that there hasn't been change over the last 30 years, but that the change that has happened has been very selective.
Yeah. Well, the government's done a pretty impressive job of, given the internet and given the fact that they need the internet, they've done a pretty, effective job of clamping things down and just holding it together. I mean, it's amazing. It's a huge country, and just I'm almost surprised they're still on top of things in the sense of maintaining control, and who knows what the future will bring. Go ahead.
I was going to say that the amazing thing is, like I said, I live in Beijing, talking to young people there about how they feel about the government and the sort of whitewashing of history, and then talking to people here in Hong Kong who they had just a completely different upbringing. You see people who've been able to read history books, who can Google, Tiananmen 1989. Like, these people are very aware of the history and the background of this whole question of universal suffrage has been on the table for many, many years, and people are aware of that. There's this idea, and in Hong Kong, you also have a whole history of protest that has not been true in the mainland.
Right.
In 2012, there were these protests against the patriotic education that the Hong Kong government was trying to impose. Back in 2003, you had these protests against the national security law that was going to you're going to be able to jail people for dissent, basically. And there were massive protests against these policies that worked. And so this protest is definitely the biggest. But it doesn't come out of nowhere. It's, every year on July 1st, there are pro-democracy protests in Hong Kong. So it's just a different tradition.
So where are we now? So the meeting was canceled and the students said, okay, we're going to hit the streets big time
again.
The principal. And how big time did they hit the streets? What was last night, your time? I mean, Friday night. What was that like?
Friday night was the biggest return to the streets of this past week, at least. So it's been going on for 2 weeks. I would say it peaked that first week. Tens of thousands of people across different parts of Hong Kong, different neighborhoods. Last night I was in Admiralty, which is sort of the home base of these protests. And again, the streets were flooded. Like there was no place on the streets that didn't have people as far as the eye could see. So it seems like people listened to the leaders' calls to come back out and show that they weren't satisfied with the government's response. The real tricky thing is where this is all going. What is going to allow the students to go home? Or is this stalemate just going to continue?
And I mean, how representative of Hong Kong broadly are the students? I mean, I know there are certainly people in the business community who prefer stability to this kind of thing and so on. What would you say that like a majority of the people in Hong Kong are quite unhappy with the government's approach to this? Or
well, that's certainly what the protesters say. They say that they themselves may only be in the tens of thousands. Some have said hundreds of thousands. But there's also a lot of people who have to go to work. There's a lot of people who have school and can't come out. But they say that they're representing a large swath of Hong Kong. I mean, at the same time, you do have a lot of people showing up at these protests to disrupt things and to voice their disagreement with the Occupy protesters. And that's the quote unquote silent majority that the government refers to, people who prefer stability, who don't want to see things disrupted. As far as who's a majority, it's very hard to say. I think you have a lot of people who just don't really have a very strong opinion one way or the other, obviously don't want to see Hong Kong society collapse in any way, and just want to get to work on time. And these protests have caused huge delays. So this is really the government's calculus, I think, is if they drag this out long enough, if they set up talks and then cancel talks and set up talks and cancel talks, it can drag out long enough that public opinion will build against the protesters, such that if the police finally have to move in and clear people out, they'll have the backing of average Hong Kongers.
And do you have a guess as to how this is going to play out?
If you'd asked me 2 days ago, I would have said that these talks are going to happen between students and government leaders. They will figure out some sort of face-saving compromise that would allow people to go home, allow the police to clear the streets, and let everyone declare victory. That's what I would have said. But now that didn't happen, it's very hard to see how this plays out. At this point, you could see it dragging out for weeks, even months. Because at this point, the longer it drags out, the less anyone wants to give in, to give any compromises.
And it could, in principle, get violent. I mean, in a way, it's almost miraculous it hasn't yet. But can you imagine like Beijing, the troops coming in from mainland China and suppressing, or the Hong Kong police really getting physical? Can you imagine a Tiananmen Square or what?
I think it's very hard to imagine right now. I think the Beijing government has actually gotten some praise, even from people who never praise it, for their restraint here, for recognizing, yeah, sure, there was tear gas used that first weekend, September 29th, against protesters, and there was huge backlash because of it. So they recognize, one, that any use of force will immediately sway public opinion back to the side of the protesters, and two, they are as aware as anyone of the historical overtones of using force against protesters here. So I think that they want to avoid at all costs clearing people violently.
Mm-hmm.
So I actually think they would be prepared to let this drag on for a long time before resorting to anything like that.
Okay. I had like kind of I dreamed up a scenario uh, where the government could do this face-saving thing to nip it in the bud, and it has to do with the fact that suddenly, coincidentally, I guess, the chief executive of Hong Kong has got this little scandal he's in the middle of, right?
Yeah,
This,
yeah.
this corruption thing where it turns out that I guess some Australian company that he gave some big contract to had, as it happens, given him $6 million or
Oh,
something, right?
yeah, as he was about to become the chief executive of Hong Kong.
Right.
Uh, yeah, no, it's this very mysterious leak that happened just this week,
Yeah.
where we suddenly learned that CY Leung has took all this money from an Australian company in order to advocate their interests in Hong Kong. And yeah, I mean, you could like pick your conspiracy theory. Like
Yeah.
it could be the Beijing government wants him out and wants an excuse
Exactly.
to
See, this
hunt
is
him down.
perfect for them because the students' big demand is that he step down, right? And
Right,
so
exactly.
now the Beijing could say, "Oh, well, he's stepping down because of this corruption thing. We have to investigate this. Yes, he's stepping down, and we'll establish a committee that'll
Mhm.
determine who the next guy's going to be. And meanwhile, here's the interim and blah blah blah, and hope that things kind of die down because in one sense, the students will have gotten their demand, right?
Yeah, I mean, there's a history of Hong Kong chief executives stepping down after protests due to health reasons. Um, that happened in the early 2000s, and yeah, I mean, at this point, it's hard to imagine CY Leung continuing with any remote amount of credibility. And the problem though is that once he steps down, how do you who replaces him? How does that process happen? And does that satisfy the students, or are they just enraged anew because they're reminded that they're never going to have
Mm-hmm.
someone who they feel represents Hong Kong's interests?
Has this issue kind of entered their rhetoric? Has it invigorated them or anything? The corruption issue, I mean, has that become?
Oh yeah, I mean, protesters already had such a dim view of CY Leung
Uh,
that this is just one more arrow in the quiver. I
uh,
mean, all along he's been seen. He's supposed to the job of chief executive is really a terrible job. You're caught between the advocating the interests of Hong Kong to Beijing and reporting the wants and needs of Beijing to Hong Kong.
mm-hmm.
So you're sort of stuck in between, probably despised by both parties. But Hong Kongers have always thought that he was more on Beijing's side than on their side,
Well,
like advocating in one direction.
given the way the chief executive is selected, that's almost inevitable, right?
Yeah, totally. But he more so than his
I
predecessors
see.
is seen as being favorable to Beijing.
I see.
He's always described as being handpicked by Beijing. A lot of people think he's secretly a member of the Communist Party, because his rise to power was so sudden and so fast, and he has no real constituency. He people call him 689 because that's the number of votes with which he became chief executive, which is a very low number. And so it's used to kind of deride him and question his authority.
Uh-huh. Huh. Now, typically in situations like this, the government claims that this is all a Western plot. I mean, the protests.
Oh yeah,
Has
that's
there has
happening.
there been a lot of that?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, maybe not explicitly by the government, but you certainly hear it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's something that's colored this entire thing is both sides accuse the other side of being funded by some shady
Uh-huh.
government slash organization. People against the protests think they're being funded by the CIA and the British. People who support the protests think that some of these guys who've come in and disrupted the protests, tearing down tents, kicking protesters, yelling at them, they think that they are hired by either the Hong Kong government or the
Mhm.
police or even the Beijing government, maybe through the local triad gangs to
Mhm.
come and screw with the
Mhm.
protesters. So there's this complete lack of trust
Yeah.
that leads everyone to assume that everyone else is just on the dole.
I mean, it is true that often in these cases, there's some Western influence in the form of like National Endowment for Democracy or any number of NGOs that are kind of, like in Kiev. There were NGOs that had set up, they would call it fostering civil society or whatever. But
Right, right.
what has there been much of that in Hong Kong that you're aware of?
I don't think we've seen evidence of that.
Yeah.
I mean, some people pointed to some embassy officials meeting with protest leaders a
Mm-hmm.
while back as evidence of um, U.S. meddling. But the embassy people pointed out that we meet with everyone. They meet with people from sectors across society.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, of course, there are connections. Some pro-democracy legislators went to the U.S. and met with Joe Biden, and Biden released some statement, sort of vaguely supporting the democratic movement. So people who want to see that the malicious hand of the U.S. there can't. There's plenty of evidence that they can point to. Whether the U.S. is buying face masks and bananas for the protesters to survive. I have not seen any evidence of that.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, I guess we'll stay tuned and see how this plays out. And
Yeah.
you don't want to close with any predictions. It sounds like wisely you don't want to close.
Right now is as unpredictable as a
Yeah.
moment as there's been. So probably best not to.
Wise man. Wise man. Wise man. You're wise beyond your years, Chris. Um,
Oh,
thank you. Thanks a lot for taking the time. I think you had to get up a little earlier than you might have otherwise, and we appreciate it.
no problem. Thanks so much, Bob. This was great.
Okay. Take care.